Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Book 2 of Plato's Republic. So Book 2 picks up where Book 1 left off. So if you watched my video on Book 1, you'll know that that book is primarily concerned with defining justice. And at the end of the book, neither Socrates nor any of the people he's talking to are particularly pleased with the definition that they come down on. And what Book 2 starts with, I had read this in the video about Book 1, but what Book 2 starts with is this. When I had said this, I thought I had done with the discussion, but it turned out to have been only a prelude. Glaucon showed his characteristic courage on this occasion too, and refused to accept Thrasymachus's abandonment of the argument. Socrates, he said, do you want to seem to have persuaded us that it is better in every way to be just than unjust, or do you want truly to convince us of this? I want truly to convince you, I said, if I can. Well, then you certainly aren't doing what you want. So Glaucon, and then later, so Thrasymachus basically drops out because he was kind of a dick and not especially interesting or philosophical. But Glaucon and Adeimantus, sorry, two brothers, they pick up the argument, and they give a much better argument than Thrasymachus does. So basically, these brothers spend the first portion of Book 2 making these fairly lengthy speeches arguing for the superiority of being unjust rather than being just. But unlike Thrasymachus, who genuinely puts forward this argument in the spirit of thinking that this is the correct position, the brothers put forward their arguments with the express purpose of allowing Socrates to dismantle the claims that they're making, thereby making his argument about how justice is superior to injustice. So these are very lengthy speeches that they make in support of injustice. But because of the particular terms that they have set for the argument, namely that they want Socrates to prove that justice is good in and of itself, as opposed to good because it brings you good things like a positive reputation, money, fame, etc., etc. So because of this, Socrates has to figure out a way of responding to the claims that they have made. And the way that he does this is he returns to his argument by analogy technique from Book 1. But this time, there's a very particular analogy that he's using. Because he says here, I'll tell you, we say, don't we, that there is the justice of a single man and also the justice of a whole city. I think this is Glaucon, who says, certainly. Socrates says, and a city is larger than a single man. Glaucon says, it is larger. Socrates says, perhaps then there is more justice in the larger thing, and it will be easier to learn what it is. So if you're willing, let's first find out what sort of thing justice is in a city, and afterwards look for it in the individual, observing the ways in which the smaller is similar to the larger. So this is really the core concern of the Republic, is how justice functions at the level of the city-state. And then working backwards, how that reflects on justice as it's experienced or practiced by individuals. So this is really the core concern of this book as a whole, the Republic as a whole document. It gets introduced here in section 2. And so Socrates essentially creates a hypothetical city, starting from the most basic elements of, like, what sort of people do you need? So you need farmers, you need craftspeople, and they sort of work through all of these different people who provide necessary services for the collective to exist. And I'll come back to that idea of the collective in just a little bit, because I think that's remarkably important. But they work through all of these different people. So you need a farmer. You need various types of craftspeople to make things. You need traders to import goods that can't be easily made domestically. You need shepherds. You need carpenters to build houses and walls and whatever kind of thing. All of these different people that you need. And one of the things that they determine for the ideal city is that each person will only have a single task. So the farmers, for instance, will only be farmers. They wouldn't be farmers who also serve on juries, or farmers who are also in the military during campaign seasons, things like this. All of which was very standard in Athens. Like that was especially in a city like Athens with its direct democracy. People had their sort of primary occupation, whether that was farmers, whether that was aristocrats, whether that was merchants, whatever it was. But then citizens would also serve in the juries. They would make political decisions by serving or by participating in the ecclesia. Citizens would serve in governmental positions of various kinds that were appointed by lot. So, in this sense, the ideal city that Socrates and his companions here are setting up is an anti-democratic city from the perspective of Athenian democracy. Because they are saying, no, people shouldn't be serving in multiple roles. They should have one task that they're responsible for. So essentially, this is specialization of labor, like an extreme specialization of labor, where if you are a shoemaker, that's all that you do. You should not be concerned with or interested in any other type of task or any other concern that doesn't fall under the category of being a shoemaker. So that's essentially the system that they're coming up with. One of the things that becomes really central to this discussion is the idea of the guardians. And so one of the things is that one of the interlocutors objects to the idea that the people in this ideal city would just live at a very basic level. So, like, Socrates initially is envisioning them, like, sitting on the ground and having the most basic meals of, like, simple vegetables and nuts and beans and whatever it is. And the various people, or at least some of the people he's discussing this with, are like, yeah, but the people wouldn't want that. Like, you're envisioning them being fed like animals. Like, like farm animals. They would want sweet foods. They would want wine. They would want various kinds of luxury goods, nice chairs with cushions and whatever luxury goods 5th and 4th century Athenians wanted. And that produces an interesting paradox, because Socrates says here, and the land, I suppose, that used to be adequate to feed the population we had then will cease to be adequate and become too small. What do you think? The other person says the same. And Socrates says, then we'll have to seize some of our neighbors' land if we're to have enough pasture and plowland. And won't our neighbors want to seize part of ours as well, if they too have surrendered themselves to the endless acquisition of money and have overstepped the limit of their necessities? That's completely inevitable, Socrates. Oh, this is Glaucon. He clarifies it here. Then our next step will be war, Glaucon, won't it? Glaucon says it will. Socrates says, we won't say yet whether the effects of war are good or bad, but only that we've now found the origins of war. It comes from those same desires that are most of all responsible for the bad things that happen to cities and the individuals in them. Glaucon says that's right. Socrates says, then the city must be further enlarged, and not just by a small number either, but by a whole army, which will do battle with the invaders in defense of the city's substantial wealth and all the other things we mentioned. Glaucon says, why aren't the citizens themselves adequate for that purpose? Socrates says, they won't be, if the agreement you and the rest of us made when we were founding the city was a good one. For surely we agreed, if you remember, that it's impossible for a single person to practice many crafts or professions well. So, there's a couple of interesting things here, one of which is that Socrates identifies the foundation of war as the desire for more resources, which is probably a pretty accurate assessment in most cases. But he also says this creates a cycle where the more resources you acquire, the more soldiers you need to defend it. And the more soldiers you need to defend your resources, the more soldiers you need. Or because the more resources you need, and therefore you need more soldiers. So this is a vicious cycle where by acquiring more territory, you then require more people to defend it. And because you have more people, you need to acquire more territory, and then you need more people to defend that increased territory, etc., etc. So this is a problem of the ideal city, in a way. And Socrates, I think, recognizes that problem, but he's not ultimately that interested in it necessarily, in part because he starts from the assumption that the city needs soldiers. It needs a military capacity. So he doesn't look too closely into that. And it's worth noting that we go very quickly from this sort of vaguely defined army to the term guardians. So actually within this same page, in this version, it's in the Hackett version, it's page 49. We go from discussion of the army at the top of the page to the guardians by the end of the page. And I think that's an interesting shift, because guardian suggests a defender or a protector, whereas the army that Socrates talks about from the bottom of page 48 to the top of page 49, that army is meant to capture more resources. I mean, he says, we'll have to seize some of our neighbors' land. That's not guardians. That's aggression, which is not the same as the defensive capacity suggested by the term guardians. So that's interesting, I think. Then, in the latter portion of Book 2, the end portion, Socrates starts to turn toward the question of what kinds of stories will be allowed to be told in the ideal city, because he sees storytelling, and I'll talk more about this with book 3, because this is really a much more central concern in book 3, but he sees stories as exclusively having a pedagogical purpose. So stories in Socrates' ideal city function exclusively to teach moral lessons, especially moral lessons to the guardians. He puts no value on things like entertainment. He puts no apparent value on, say, raising ideological questions, which is interesting because, of course, Socrates himself is the great questioner. But he envisions for this ideal city an extremely strict control over narratives, over stories, over art and culture, with the intention exclusively of teaching the guardians good values. There's no I'll talk more about his view, the views on art he develops in the Republic with the video on book 3, so stay tuned for that. But yeah, it's a rather a depressing view he takes of art and storytelling. But I wanted to come back to this point earlier in book 2 at the founding of the ideal city, because Socrates says here, I think a city comes to be because none of us is self-sufficient, but we all need many things. Do you think that a city is founded on any other principle? I think this is Adeimantus, says no. And Socrates says, and because people need many things, and because one person calls on a second out of one need, and on a third out of a different need, many people gather in a single place to live together as partners and helpers, and such a settlement is called a city. Now the footnote here is interesting. It says, note that a city, the polis in Greek, is a collection of people, not a collection of buildings. And I think that's really significant because I think we tend to intuitively think of a city as an urban landscape. We think like New York City, for instance. We think of like the New York skyline. We think maybe of like the shots from movies of like looking down on Manhattan from an overhead shot or things like this. We think of the city as the buildings, the geographic space that it's composed of. But Socrates here is saying none of that is actually important. What's important is the people. And of course, this is a city-state. So slightly different than something like New York or London or Johannesburg, Beijing, whatever it is. This is a city-state. So this is a nation, more or less. Athens or Thebes or Sparta or Corinth. These are all independent political entities. And so in that sense, it's very interesting that Socrates is identifying the city-state with the people in it, because that's a very collectivist view, which I think makes it really somewhat ironic that he then advocates, well, no, I guess it's not. It's ultimately he sort of comes down on a kind of noblesse oblige idea where this is almost feudal in a way, where like the guardians are meant to protect the city, and as part of protecting it, they are essentially in control of the population. But that idea, I think, is really significant, and it's in some ways fundamental to the democratic assumption that power should be dispersed among the people. There's this idea that the city, the polity, is a collective of humans, and that those humans are the central element of the body politic.